For those that might not have joined the original session, my name is Joseph Holbrook, and basically I'm a cloud architect, a blockchain architect as well lately. I do a ton of cloud computing around AWS and Google, training, deployments, etc. And I'm a fairly widely known course author, and I'm based out of Jacksonville, Florida. So what I like to do now is just clarify where we're at in the series and then get to basically where we're going to go with the rest of the series. Now, the first webinar, we talked about the basics of DevOps. So we talked about what is continuous integration, what is continuous deployment, what are the services we could use on AWS, for example. So we talked about pipelines and how to deploy them briefly. And now what we want to do is to actually start deploying resources. To do that, though, we have to learn about infrastructure as code. And in AWS, we call this CloudFormation. That's for today. Webinar number 3 next Tuesday, this coming Tuesday coming up, I should say, we're going to talk about creating the pipeline. After we deploy the service, we then wanted to, the code, the service, etc. We want to go ahead and talk about creating a pipeline. Then webinar 4, we want to bring it all together and understand how we could integrate with on-prem services such as Jenkins, for example, and integrate it with AWS. So we have a lot to cover in the series, so let's get started. By the end of the webinar, I hope you're going to understand the basics of CloudFormation. You should also know some of the terminology we're going to use. For example, with the template, we're going to need to know what resources are. We're going to need to know some of the brief coding. We're going to need to know what a YAML template is. We're going to talk about all those things. We're going to talk about designing your infrastructure as code structure. We're going to talk about what CloudFormation Designer is, and then we're going to put it all together. And also, as part of the demo, I'm going to go ahead and deploy a sample template in CloudFormation and show you how it works and walk you through the template. When it comes to AWS, we want to know about automation. That's really what it's all about. With AWS, we have tools that we could put together and create an AWS DevOps pipeline. Some of these tools we talked about last week, such as CloudFormation, Cloud Pipeline, or Code Pipeline, that is, Code Build, Code Deploy, CodeStar, ECS, and EBS. And again, we could use other services as well if we so choose, such as S3 as a repository briefly, just to bring things into the cloud. So we have a lot of flexibility. When it comes to CloudFormation, it is basically AWS's infrastructure as code solution. AWS CloudFormation is the best way to write, deploy, and maintain your AWS infrastructure. It's going to create efficient solutions around our application deployments. It uses YAML for creating templates, but you could also, for example, create a text file locally, and as long as you use the proper scripting, you could upload the template and it'll convert it over to YAML, for example. So again, you don't have to know YAML, it'll help convert over. You can also describe resources with JSON as well. And what it's also interesting is that it's got other features built in, such as for audit trails. One of the challenges that we generally have in the enterprise world is meeting compliance requirements. It's not always an easy thing to understand what we need for PCI or what we need for HIPAA or for GDPR even. Sometimes the best way to meet compliance requirements is just to keep track of everything. Now, there's pros and cons to that, I know, But until you understand each of the compliance requirements in detail, then sometimes just having a full audit trail is really the only way to meet the requirement. Now with AWS, when we deploy a DevOps stack, we want to realize that we need to really go ahead and get started understanding, for example, what code commit is, what code build, what code deploy is, and where that all fits in. But basically with AWS, we have pipeline tools, source code tools, a repository. We also have build services. For example, we create a pipeline with code pipeline for our CI pipeline. But if we want to go ahead and have basically a mutable source code record or repository, we go ahead and use, for example, code commit, for example, to help manage that. So we have a lot of different scenarios to consider. And you could see, for example, how this all sort of fits in and compares to the AWS stack, to the DevOps stack. Code commit, we're going to be using for coding, but for building and testing our pipeline, our CI pipeline, we want to use code pipeline. When we deploy, basically when we take it from development and start to roll it out into production, we want to use code deploy. Now, as part of the provisioning and monitoring, we have other services, CloudFormation. For example, we probably want to use CloudFormation to deploy 100 EC2 instances at the same time. We don't want to go in and manually deploy them if we don't have to, right? That can be pretty time consuming. With CloudFormation, we're essentially deploying a stack. Before we deploy a stack, we're going to create a stack. I'm going to walk you through a short demo, and what we're going to do is deploy, for example, an S3 bucket. Just a very simple script. We're going to walk you through, show you how the script works. And then if time permits, we'll add on to that script EC2 instances and other services. If we don't get to it today, we'll get to it next week if needed. But for time purposes, we have a lot to cover. Now, when I go through the console here and go through the demo, I'll walk you through how all this works. So rest assured, let me know if you have any questions as well. Now, how does this really work? How does CloudFormation work basically from a process perspective? One of the things to pay attention to with CloudFormation is that you need to create a stack. So the CS stack means it's a CloudFormation stack. This is going to trigger, for example, an EC2 launch. Now, if we want to deploy a LAMP stack, basically Linux, for example, any other database services, etc., we could go ahead and put it all together in a stack and deploy it. Once it's launched, it's going to use what's called the Cloud Init agent on the instance and run that as well. Then the third thing that happens is that the data script will install and then kick off CF init. So this is another process that's going to run. And that CF init is going to download the metadata and resources from CloudFormation. And I'll walk you through a whiteboard with this as well shortly. With CFN, it'll also kick off the scripts as well. So again, from a memorization standpoint, you don't need to memorize this. This is just giving you an idea of how it works. Now, before we get into CloudFormation, let's just talk briefly about how all this really comes together. Now, code commit is a managed version control service. This is a GitHub. Think of this as like a GitHub on AWS, except for that it's hosted locally and not on a remote server somewhere else. That's not in AWS. Code build is a build service. Now, again, code build is a little bit more than what it says. It's a lot more little features and bells and whistles that you want to know about, but it's a powerful service to really integrate your source code into AWS and a pipeline. Now, when I say a pipeline, for those that are part of like a DevOps group, sometimes we would call that a mainline. A mainline is a pipeline, vice versa. Like with Google Cloud, they like to call it a pipeline, but with IBM, it's basically, again, called a mainline as well. And then with IBM Cloud, they have a different name. Basically, it's like a dev line. So it's really the same thing. Sometimes cloud providers like to uniquely name their services. Okay, code deploy. Now, this is a really nice service that you can definitely use to minimize your downtime, to minimize your deployment time, I should say, as well. And you could set up, for example, your redundancy with that. Now, code pipeline is really meant to basically put the tools together. And it's really, when you're using pipeline, you're using the repository, you're using the commitment tools, the deployment tools, and you're putting it together. So that's what code pipeline does. And if you look at the previous chart, if I'm going to go back to the chart over here. So for example, here, code pipeline sort of puts everything together in a way and allows you to roll out that pipeline. So the pipeline doesn't show the overlap with the code, but it sort of does overlap. So just be aware. Okay, let's talk about CloudFormation now a little bit more in detail. Now there's some terminology that we want to cover before I go to the demo so that you understand what a template is and what a stack is and what a parameter is. So a template is what? It's exactly what it sounds like. It's basically a document that you're creating that is going to put together the areas of the stack that you want to deploy, the services that you want to add, the resources. Now, the template is basically going to be a YAML. We want to ensure that we put in everything that we want so that when we kick off the template, it's going to follow the instructions that we give it pretty much. Now, the stack is exactly what a stack, as you would expect, right? It's going to have different layers as part of the processes that are going to deploy. Now, when it comes to a stack, we want to think of, for example, a stack as basically sort of like kicking off the template. For example, a template is generally in YAML, but it could be in JSON too, so forgive me. And when it kicks off, basically, it's going to have like a description of the infrastructure. The stack is going to basically kick off the template. So that's where the order comes. So what I'm doing is I'm going basically from left down to the bottom, and then I'm going to move over to the right down to the bottom. So just so you can see the workflow. And then when we talk about parameters, that's basically what? Basically, we want to, select 2 or 20, or we want to kick off for so many minutes or terminate after this. Basically, a parameter is exactly what you would think. It's basically a variable that we want to add to the stack when we deploy it. Now, generally, when you're kicking off services, you're going to have many parameters, for example, around EC2, around S3, etc., around your VPC. Resources is exactly, again, this is fairly straightforward, but I got to cover it because the most confusing part I find for students is a template and a stack. Everything else is easy. So think of the template as the starting point. That's the document that really puts everything together. The stack is going to be what kicks it off. And then as part of everything else, we have resources, events, and parameters. Events are exactly in the sense that if something triggers or something fails, and I'll show you where you find out all this information when we go to the demo. And again, here's the terminology spelled out for you. I won't read it verbatim. And then we have create, update, delete, and events again. Now, create, once again, is going to do what? We're going to go ahead and deploy a new stack. Update is what? We're going to go ahead and make changes to what's already been, created or deployed. Delete is we're going to remove something from the stack. And then I didn't cover rollback. Basically, rollback is when we kick off something and something fails, we got to bring it back in. So basically, rollback is saying we got to go fix something and then start over. And there's a few more before we get into the demo: config, config set, and resource. If there's any questions, feel free to speak up. But again, config is what? This is going to be basically what is going to determine or specify how the instance is going to deploy. And then the config set is going to be what? A set of configs. So we could have one config or 20 configs, and the config set is a collection of everything. And then a resource is going to be, for example, an EC2 instance. It could be S3, it could be EBS, whatever it is. And again, terminology is there. Now with CloudFormation, we have metadata, we have user data, and then CFN init. Now, metadata is usually what? It's data about data, and that is pretty straightforward. There's nothing tricky about that. Now, the user data is a little bit tricky because the user data is going to describe essentially like a script about how this should be deployed for the users. So it's not really user data per se. It's sort of like almost like a deployment script in my opinion, but that's the term that they use. So that's what I'm going to stick with. And then we have CFN init. This is again the agent. And this is again what we're going to use to kick everything off. And then these are some other terms. I won't read every one to you, but I did want to point out mappings. Now, mappings, we want to use mappings for several reasons. The first thing is, let's say, for example, we want a way to map EC2 instances in, let's say, Northern Virginia to users that are in Maryland. So we want to create a mapping to do that. Or let's say we have GDPR compliance requirements to meet, and we want to map those compliance requirements for like S3 or for CloudTrail to a certain value. We would want to create a mapping to do that. Now, some other terminologies there. Again, I won't go through every one for time purposes. I do want to get to the demo and walk you through the console. Some other terminology I think is worth knowing is the API version. It's very important to pay attention to the APIs you deploy in the version as well. Now, there's what's called a crossstack reference. Okay, this is an approach basically to reference Cloud Foundry to another stack in the account. For example, if, and generally the last time I've seen this used, for example, is let's say, for example, I want to deploy an application, and this application is going to use different types of virtual machines. But I want to create a stack just for virtual machines for production, one for development, one for QA, etc. So I'm going to reference the stack, but I'm going to use the same version of database or other services such like a VPC. I'm going to use a different VPC or the same VPC. I want to use this to reference basically another stack, and it could be a VPC, it could be a EC2 stack, it could be EBS, whatever it is. So this is a way to put things together without actually putting it together formally. So we're doing a cross reference. It's like a link. Another way to look at it is like a linking. Okay, let's talk about some tasks, and we're just about done with the PowerPoint before I get to the demo. Now, with CloudFormation, there's some tasks that we're going to want to do. or review what CloudFormation does when it kicks off. Basically, there's an editor. We could write a template in CloudFormation. There's a CloudFormation tool. It's called the configuration management tool we could use. We have a stack creator we could use. A lot of tools in there. There's a text editor, of course. But what's going to happen is it's going to look at syntax issues. For example, if you forgot to add a termination to the script, or you forgot to add a double colons, for example, or you didn't add the end of the parentheses to the script, then again, that'll point out that maybe there's an issue. Or you spelt an AWS service incorrectly. For example, you might spell EC2, but by accident, you said AC2, and it would catch that in the resource type. So when we specify resource type, we want to say EC2. Or if we're talking about S3, we're going to say S3. It'll catch those errors. Logical errors. So this is a little different. These are basically going to validate errors that don't appear to make sense, like adding 10 and trying to deduct 11. Provisioning, this is where it's going to create the stack. So basically, think of like the validate as sort of like the preview mode, and then we get to the provision mode. This is where it's going to deploy. If everything looks good, the preview looks good, we're going to go ahead and provision. Then, if that looks good, we're going to get to the outputs, where it's going to say creating stack, basically. And then once it's done, it'll say formed. And then if there's any other issues, it'll update, and there'll be a review log that we'll look at as well. Now, with the configuration management, a couple things to point out here. With this, for example, we have our application and our configuration. This is part of our config file. We want to add our application, our assets, our config files. And then part of the config, part of basically the configuration of CloudFormation, we want to add any prerequisites. So if there's any prerequisites, for example, like download the most recent version of Microsoft Word, or whatever we're deploying, right? Whatever service we're adding. Or if we're going to use like IaaS, for example, there's a lot of bug fixes to add. So we could kick that off with the config. Here's an example of a configuration script. We have basically, you could see that type. It basically tells you what it is. It's an EC2 instance. Metadata, if we're going to add that. And then user data will specify, for example, location or the user information. But the user data too is going to be, again, like I stated earlier, not really totally like about the user, but more about what the application is going to do. But again, you have flexibility in what you want to do. Like, for example, any attributes we're going to deploy. And I'll go through a couple examples here shortly. And here's an example of a simple script. So I'm going to go ahead and deploy basically what I call the learning template. So you could, again, you could download this if you want from GitHub. I'll post it if you want, but it's a very simple script. We're just going to go ahead and deploy a S3 bucket and name it. And that's the most simplest part of the script to deploy. Now, the mandatory part that we have to add is resources. So we have to name the bucket and define the resource type. Now, other other basically sections of the template could be like the description, the metadata, parameters, mappings, other variables that we want to add. They're not mandatory, but we absolutely need to have resources. So here's a visual of how this works from an infrastructure standpoint. We're going to go ahead and create our CloudFormation stack. We're going to, and let me get my pen here. So the first thing is we create our stack. once we do that, we launch EC2, for example. We then validate any user data and apply that. And then in the background, we have, of course, the AWS service looking at our metadata and then kicking off CFN and init and any instances that are part of the config workflow. And again, remember, it's going to trigger the stack. It's going to launch Cloud init, the agent on the instance. There's a script, download, and it runs the configs as we just sort of went through here briefly. All right, so the most of one thing, let me go back. One of the things to think about too is sometimes it's just easier to learn visually. So I try not to just spend a lot of time on PowerPoint. So I'm going to go to the demo here in a second. One thing I did want to point out is when we put it all together, this is one of the first things we got to do is create our infrastructure, and then we could deploy our pipelines and get that ready to go once we know how we want to deploy our infrastructure. So if we have an application we want to deploy in a pipeline, we have to get the infrastructure ready. And this is part of this process we want to do. All right, so let's go, and I'm going to go change my screen here to the browser. Give me 1 second. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and bring up my browser, and then what we want to do is deploy a template and then talk about CloudFormation. All right. Okay, let me share my screen on mine now. Looks like let's make sure I'm in the right one. All right, and let me share my screen as well. And well, why isn't that working? Oh, there it is. That's weird. I don't see my browser there. All right, let me try this. Let me know if it works. All right, so that should be working.
I can see AWS Management Console.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, I was looking for the browser, but again, that's fine. That works. Okay. So what we want to do now is let's go ahead and talk about how CloudFormation is and how it works and deploy a template. Now, one of the things to point out is you could see, for example, there's been a couple stacks that have been deployed. For example, I have a couple blockchain templates that I deployed. And if we want to deploy one, it's very simple. We could do this a couple different ways. We could create our own or go use the AWS templates to do this as well. Now, we could also deploy a VPC template, and we go ahead and do this. You can see that it creates a VPC. And the first thing that it does is, of course, deploys a stack, and it creates the subnet routes, the tables, adds the routes, ACLs, for example. And I won't go through all that, but you could see that the events are listed. Now, what about resources? What's it deploying for resources? You could see that it's deploying EC2 resources, and it's adding basically routes and tables and subnets and ACLs to what? EC2. The completion status is complete. Now, again, very straightforward. Now, what we want to do now is I want to go select create a stack. Actually, before I do that, is I need to show you a few things down here. Now, when we, okay, so a couple things to look at. Let me just show you before I forget. We go ahead and create a stack here, but if we want to edit a stack, we would select the stack, for example, and then edit it. But there's also what's called design templates. Now, I didn't cover this because this is actually more work in a lot of cases than actually sort of deploying a template that you modify. So for example, if I click template, I could just go ahead and add, for example, to the template. So let me go ahead and just show you. Notepad. And I saved a template here, right here. Okay, so this is a script, basically a template script that I could add. And I would simply go over here and probably, it might be easier to do this and just get rid of this because it's only going to confuse things. And then I just paste it in there. So basically I can go ahead in and add that. Do you see how, so it says designer's out of date, hit refresh, and it's doing that because it basically, because I changed it, right? So again, it's going to let me know that it's out of date. So I go over here. Now it's hard to see. It's going to be in the top right corner, a refresh diagram. Do you see how it basically adds a bucket, an Amazon S3 bucket? Now, what had happened is I took this code and it basically defined the resource as an S3 bucket. And what I want to do now is I'm going to deploy this as, for example, instead of my S3 bucket, I want to deploy this as, let's say, a QuickStart bucket. And then I want to save this as, let's say, QuickStart. So now what I could do is I could go ahead and I could do a few things. So I could create a stack out of this. I could also open up and add another template, but there's also sample templates as well. So for example, one of the more common ones we probably will run into is how to deploy, for example, a LAMP stack. We're going to want to deploy a LAMP stack, for example, for WordPress. And I think there's a template for that usually. So this is WordPress multi-availability zones. Again, they don't have a really good, what I would call sampling here, but it's there for the taking. So let's go back and instead of deploying that, what I want to do is I want to show you a few things before. Oh, also too, so one of the things too that this does, so let's say I deploy S3, but what about if I want to also deploy some other services like, oh, let's see, S3, oh, let's just do EC2. So I go to EC2, and what I want to do is, let's say I want to go ahead and add, usually I like to add, for example, let's say a NAT gateway. So I simply add a NAT gateway, and you could see that it's going to add a NAT gateway with some default variables. And so what I could do is I go ahead, I could modify, for example, where this is located. And then two, I want to name this, for example, test QuickStart, let's say. So this is my template, and I want to save this as YAML, or I could save it as JSON. Now what's cool is that it'll change the format. So it automatically would change this diagram to either JSON or YAML, whatever you prefer. If you know JavaScript, most folks will probably prefer JSON. If you don't, YAML's more of a sort of textual based, very, directive sort of approach. So it's a little bit easier to understand. And then I could also add, for example, a security group as part of this. And it doesn't matter where you drop anything. It'll again order this. But again, I could make this however I want. I could have my EC2 instances here. It'll go ahead and update, again, where it's located and the structure. So I'm going to go ahead and save this as test QuickStart. I could then go over here, validate the template. And when I do that, it's going to go ahead and scan the template. And it'll probably find a few things that are not right because, again, I haven't added everything that really should be added. But again, if I go here to validate, see, it says it's valid, but I probably don't want to deploy this because I don't really have any working services yet. So again, I could go ahead. Now, let's say, for example, here, I want to deploy a CI pipeline. Now, what I'll probably do next week, I'm going to create a pipeline with the template and walk you through how to deploy, for example, code build, code commit, code pipeline, for example, with, let's say CloudTrail and some other services. So we'll go through and talk about that, deploying that. Now, what's cool is that it gives you the components and tells you about the metadata. You could also modify deletion policy. For example, nothing's been specified, but if I wanted to, I could add that. Now I could add dependencies. For example, why do I want to add a dependency? Well, let's say I want to make sure that I could deploy this if, in other words, I don't want to add like objects to a bucket if, for example, those objects have not, been validated or out of date, for example. So I could add like, different variables to this to basically specify like a date of upload or a date that it was created, whatever I want to do. It's pretty flexible. So let's go back to, I'm just going to leave this. We're going to talk more about that next week. So what I want to do is I want to create a bucket, and I already have my script. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go upload the QuickStart bucket template. This is a very simple script. And generally, when you're learning CloudFormation, use the simplest script first, and then you could simply add to this. So we're going to go ahead and create a stack. Now, when we create a stack, and how we do on time, I've got 5:49, we've got 10 minutes, so we have plenty of time. I'm going to go ahead and select, for example, here, in this case, I could design a template, and it will bring me back to the templates. I don't want to do that. I could then add a template from a sample template. Again, these are the same ones that we looked at in the design template. And we could also upload ones as well, and then add them to like S3. In this case, I'm going to add the one I just created, the QuickStart one I just copied over and modified the name. I'm going to choose the file, and I'm going to add the QuickStart S3 test bucket. So it added that, and now what I want to do is go next. Okay, so if there is any kind of error in the script, it would let you know. Now, for example, for time purposes, I don't have time to show you, I go back and forth, but I just want to give you an idea. So if there was any kind of like in the script here, like if I forgot to put, like for example, instead of S3, I added S2, it would say, well, what do you mean? So again, a lot of flexibility there. So I'm going to call this the QuickStart. Okay, and I have to pay attention to the name too. Object store, just, again, just as a demo. So this is a QuickStart object store demo. A little bit long of a name. Now, a couple of things to think about here. When I deploy the template, I could add keys, basically a key value pair, helps me identify something, for example, but I'm going to call this like the QuickStart bucket, just as a way. So I could search, for example, via tags and key value. So I'll call this like 1 and affiliate it with QS bucket. And this will definitely help me in a large environment in an enterprise that I might have hundreds of services and hundreds of templates. And this will help me identify the right stack. And I could add, I think, 50. Not that I've ever seen anyone go that high, but you can. Now I could add permissions. I'm going to skip over this just for time purposes, but we'll go through some of this next week as well if time permits. Now I could also add CloudWatch alarms, and I would add the ARN for that if I want. Could also monitor this, and then if I want to choose a role, what I would want to do is create a custom role for this, and then allow CloudFormation to basically kick this off if I want. So I go create, and then this gives me the template URL. Now the URL is going to be referenced later if I want. And you can see there that it's going to deploy the QuickStart object store demo and the tag is going to be QS bucket. So I'm going to go create. Now, you can see right here in orange that the create is in progress. Now, this is going to create an S3 bucket. The reality is that to create an S3 bucket is like a 1-minute task. I probably could have done it quicker just doing it manually, but this is just to give you an example. But what about if I wanted to create 20 buckets? Then this would be really easy. So what I want to do is I would go over here and then add additional buckets and deploy that. And that creates in progress. And then I go ahead and refresh, and you can see that my object has just completed. Very simple. So I go here to the demo, and you can see what did it do? It deployed my S3 bucket as expected. Now, let's go validate it. So I go over here, I go to S3, and I have a bucket called the QuickStart Object Store Demo. That is the bucket I just deployed in Northern Virginia. And you can see again, it's in Northern Virginia, again, as the region, as that's because where I was logged into. And when I go select, I could then upload to the bucket. So I simply can add, let's say, a text file just for the fun of it. And then I simply can change permissions if I want. I could allow access to other AWS users. Very powerful tools here with it. Now, when I use S3, I have to be careful to specify the right availability and costing model. Generally, standard is going to work. It's going to have at least 3 availability zones. But if I want like reduced availability, I then can select that, and it tells me, you know, options. And then I also have Glacier as well. So again, it's up to me to determine how I want to store this. I go next, I go upload, and there you go. I have my bucket available in S3. Any questions on how this works? Okay, and I think there's one more thing I want to show you here. Okay. Now, when we deploy CloudFormation, couple reminders, we want to pay attention to what we're doing. Of course, we want to plan accordingly. There's tools out there, and actually, let me show you a few things. Now, if we want, we could deploy different templates, and there's free resources out there to help get us started. So for example, the VPC one I actually grabbed from a website called cloudonot.com, and they have a nice little service where you basically go here and determine, for example, the template that you want to use. So I go ahead and go start reading infrastructure as code. And over here somewhere was a template tool, and I need to find it now. Free resources. Give me one sec. Okay, it's probably easier to. Just one second. Oh, that's not what I want. Get that out of the way. Let's go into my AdSense account. Okay. All right, so what we want is AWS CloudFormation Templates, and it's CloudOnaut or something, CloudOnaut, there it is. And there is a site, here it is, free templates. Now, this is actually really cool because they have a lot of different templates, and they actually walk you through how they work. And I would recommend, if you're getting started, to start out with this website, because it's a lot better than what AWS provides you. The AWS template site has very few and there's not really good information. AWS basically wants you to take a class and pay for it, so they don't want to give you too much information. This is actually excellent. So for example, if I want to deploy Elastic Compute, this walks you through some dependencies you might want to look at. You could launch the stack. You could select the VPC you want to add to it. Go over here to launch the stack. Name it whatever you want, so on and so on. Let me go over here and just select another one, for example, like, where is it? WordPress. So if I want to deploy WordPress, same thing. I launch the stack. It's going to ask me the stack name. I'm going to call this WP. I go create. It's going to go ahead and create basically a CloudFormation stack for WordPress. And we'll go ahead and talk more about basically CloudFormation, code pipeline, and other AWS services next week. Is there any questions? Is there anything I could answer? Okay.
All right. Thank you, Joe.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for this session. So this was part 2 of AWS, role of AWS in DevOps, and we'll see you guys in part 3. Thank you. Thank you, Joe.
Yes, thank you so much. Have a good night.